Hello and welcome to the first session of The Business of Esports. My name is Alex Fletcher. I'm founder and managing director of the Esports Group, which is a strategic consulting firm that focuses on the competitive gaming industry. I've been in esports since 2012, and I have a background in technology and consulting amongst other things. And I'll be walking you through the entire industry from top to bottom, starting with today's session where we're going to cover a quick primer to explain what esports is about, move on to some landscape terminology, and then get into a 10,000 foot view of the entire industry to give a better understanding of its size, shape, and some of the notable aspects. So for starters, what exactly is esports? Well, for one, they are various video game titles that are played competitively, often for large cash pools across the world. Now, every video game in the world is not an esport, which can sometimes be a confusing concept, but just in the same way that every game isn't a traditional sport, every video game isn't traditionally considered an esport. And most often, esports takes the form of organized multiplayer video game competitions between professional players, although there are some exceptions. There's obviously competitive play at all different levels, including the college level, and there are games that don't involve teams where they're just one versus one. Now, here's some key terms that you're going to need to understand and keep in mind as we progress through this session and the entire course. Competitive video games. This is another term for esports. An esports organization. This is what you refer to as an esports team, but the main difference here is that esports organizations house multiple competitive teams that compete across different game titles. Live streaming, these are digital streams over the web, very similar to consuming video on Netflix. Free to play. This is a video game title that doesn't cost its players anything, and its revenue is generated from the purchase of digital items within the game itself. And there's an important distinction to make here because years ago, most video game titles were sold per purchase, which meant that you had to spend X amount of money to get the video game title or to own it. Nowadays, with the advent of the internet and PC gaming, a lot of popular games are actually free to play. In other words, you can quickly and easily download them for free, and the only cost is outside of your time the purchase of any of those digital items that you may or may not use during play of the game. Maximum concurrent viewers. Since the esports market is very much driven by its fan base and its viewership, max concurrent viewers is a key performance indicator for the popularity of various live streams. So when tournaments go on air, this is a term that's used to indicate the largest number of viewers that were watching that live stream at any given time. The esports market, just goods and services offered to those who consume competitive video game content or participate in any events. Integrity, measure of protections for competition, governance, rights and responsibilities of various stakeholders, intellectual property, the core essence of video games. This is very important because every video game is owned by someone. Unlike a traditional sport where basketball isn't owned by anyone, any video game title being owned or played competitively or otherwise belongs to either a game publisher or developer. And then lastly, those video game publishers, as I mentioned, are the owners of the rights to these video games. So exactly which type of video games are typically played competitively as esports? The current slide shows 4 such genres, starting with multiplayer online battle arena, which is a game where an individual player controls a single character on one of 2 teams. And the main objective is to basically destroy the opposing team's main structure, where individual players select characters that have various abilities and advantages that improve over the course of the game. MOBAs like League of Legends are massively popular across the world, although there are others like Defense of the Ancients 2, Dota 2, that also rank up there. Fighting games like Street Fighter, this is pretty self-evident. 1 versus 1 games where you're trying to knock your opponent out. And first-person shooters. Games like Call of Duty or Counter-Strike Global Offensive are genres where the player is in a weapons-based combat scenario from a first-person perspective. The caveat here is that games like Call of Duty and Counter-Strike Global Offensive are played on teams. So while the individual player and the spectator mode shows the game from a first-person perspective, is actually a team-based game. And then last but not least, real-time strategy games. Now, real-time strategy games is a genre that actually initiated one of the world's first massively popular esport titles in StarCraft 2. And this is a game where participants attempt to maneuver and position units to control the game. And all of this happens in a real-time scenario. And the tasks that these players have to perform can be very demanding and require multiple actions per minute. But competitive video gaming is not a new phenomenon. Despite the recent outgrowth in popularity of esports, and we'll talk about a little later on why esports are more popular than they ever have been before. People have been playing video games competitively since the advent of video games themselves. It's as natural to try to be the best at a game title as it is for a player playing a traditional sport to try to be the best athlete he or she can be. Now, Starcade was the first of a TV series aimed at arcade competitions, and this spans all the way back into the early 80s. But the reality is people have gotten together to watch and compete in competitive video game play since, once again, people have been playing games themselves. Now, the concept of LANs, local area network communities, spawned from the growth of PC games like Doom or Wolfenstein 3D. And as PCs first gathered momentum as a consumer object, especially in the Western world, we saw enthusiasts begin to connect and to gather in these LAN community meetups. And those were really the forefather of the esports communities that we see today. Although it wasn't until widespread internet connectivity that we started to see this take off. Just because before the growth of the consumer internet, it was difficult to find people who played the games themselves. And not to mention the games were just played in a disconnected fashion. But the CPL, the Cyber Athlete Professional League in the late 90s, was the first attempt to professionalize the competitive play of video games. Now, there's a distinction that needs to be made here, because up to this point in time, the growth of esports in the Western world, Europe, and the Americas has differed greatly from the growth of competitive video gaming in the East, i.e. Korea, where the latter has outpaced the former pretty significantly up until recent times. A lot of this has been based on cultural perceptions of gaming in the West, and that it has been overwhelmingly negative to the extent that there hasn't been there hasn't been a lot of mainstream acceptance for competitive video games. Efforts and organizations like Major League Gaming attempted to change that, but ultimately the East was the home of esports really until we saw the takeoff of Twitch.tv, and that was an inflection point for esports in the West, just because Twitch it started as a live streaming platform where people could stream their everyday lives, but it quickly gathered or drew gamers to its as a destination to share gameplay. And at that point in time, a lot of the organic community and the grassroots growth that had taken place in the esports world really took off, because now there was a major hub for this content. And really, from Twitch's ascension and then its eventual purchase by Amazon, that's kicked off quite a bit of growth and acceptance for video game content and competitive video games in the West. In a sense, Twitch's ascension has almost happened in parallel to that. So one could argue that the takeoff of Twitch was a part of what we're seeing today of gaming becoming more an accepted outlet. So esports is a quickly expanding ecosystem of more than one game title, which means that it's not one or two or even three video game titles, nor is it one or two major professional leagues. Rather, it's an entire landscape of game titles that are played at various scales across different tiers. Now, determination of these tiers isn't accomplished by some standard governing body. Like, there is no International Olympic Committee that's going to grant standing to a given video game title to say that, yes, this is a video game title that's an esports. So up to this point, it's been determined by the community, i.e. the viewing and participating audience. And there are a couple different tiers in the esports world. The first tier contains really the big games that generate large viewership, have very active and robust player bases like League of Legends, Defense of the Ancients 2, and Counter-Strike Global Offensive. And Jans Hilger, who is one of the founding members of the professional world of esports, has gone on record and said that Tier 1 games typically feature 8 million plus monthly active users, over 5 million in US dollars of annual prize pools, and 20 million monthly hours of game content, related game content is consumed per month. So those are some pretty good key performance indicators that show or demonstrate if an esports title is in Tier 1. Once again, Jans is a longtime esports professional, very knowledgeable person, but this is not an exact science. The reality is that there are a lot of different games vying at a lot of different levels to be considered esports. Tier 2 games like Overwatch or even Vainglory, these games tend to feature 1.5 million monthly active users, over 1 million in US dollars of annual prize pool, and 2 million of monthly hours watched. And these categories are flexible in that, let's say, for example, Defense of the Ancients 2, Dota 2 slipped over the next year or so. There's nothing that's going to keep it an esport if people don't watch it, if people don't play it. So these categories are, once again, community driven and really supported by a viewing audience who are either playing the games or consuming content, gameplay content. Now, what about video games that are about sports? I mean, the word esports indicates that, hey, shouldn't sports video games, should they be considered esports? Well, not exactly. And the reality is that just as Tier 1 or Tier 2 or Tier 3 game titles, those categories aren't strictly defined. The notion of a certain game not being an esport, it depends really on the community, the viewing audience. So while games like the aforementioned League of Legends or Counter-Strike Global Offensive are considered in Tier 1, games like FIFA or NBA 2K and even Madden, they can still have a claim to be in esports. Now, within the gaming community, it's typically been that more difficult games like MOBAs, first-person shooters, RTS games have held more captive hold over their audience because they're just more complex and difficult to master. It's impossible to beat these games. There's no end level, there's no end game to League of Legends. Like there's a unlimited upside to gaining skill in these games, whereas sports video games are typically a little easier to master, but they're also easier to understand. So fans of sports like basketball, football, European football gravitate towards these sports titles, even though they're not considered traditional esports. Now, with the increased investment by traditional sports properties into the world of competitive gaming, there's going to be a lot more profile for games like FIFA and NBA 2K and even Madden. So it's yet to be seen exactly what that added investment, and we'll go over that later in the course, will mean towards improving the profile of sports-based video games. Now, are these electronic games, are they sport? And this has a number of implications in that if competitive video games are just considered electronic sport but not traditional sport, there are some very real legal and even cultural implications for that standing. For example, certain countries classify athletes who participate in sports a lot differently. On top of that, the global nature of electronic sport means that it does matter how visiting players are classified in terms of being granted visas as they cross the world to compete in person in esports tournaments and leagues. The biggest difference between electronic sports and traditional sport is that esport is really a looser term than the concept of sport. So sport is very governed and maintained by certain bodies who have relationships with rights holders and an active ecosystem of very clearly defined players. Esports, because of their nature as video games, is still evolving that level of organization and governance. And obviously, traditional sports are all about physical activity, whereas esports they're video games. And so the takeaway here is that in order for electronic sport to gain more standing and move closer to being considered as a real sport, it has a little less to do with cultural acceptance than some might assume, and more to do with evolving that governance, that organization, the top-down structure that helps traditional sports thrive through the years, esports has to build before it can officially be or join that category, regardless if people agree with it being a sport or not. But at the end of the day, the biggest distinction between digital competition and athletic competition is the role of game publishers. Now, this is a key concept to keep in mind. As we mentioned in the key terms section, game publishers, they're the ultimate rights holders in esports, where leagues and teams rule the day in traditional sports. In esports, these game publishers are where the games begin and where they end. Now, their approaches to competitive video games vary. So on this slide, you can see we have Riot Games. They are the publisher of League of Legends, Activision Blizzard, publishers of Call of Duty and Overwatch, and then Valve Software. They publish Dota 2 and Counter-Strike Global Offensive. But their approach to and even involvement in these given game communities varies. And a lot of that has to do with the culture at these companies, but also a lot of it has to do with the nature of the games and their game communities themselves. So there's no one way for these game publishers to be involved with esports, but the reality is that they own those games and nothing can happen without their consent. So, for example, a Riot Games, they're extremely involved and keep a very close pulse on League of Legends esports, right? To the point that they're basically the judge, jury, and executioner for their professional league. Whereas a company like Valve, which owns two major esports, they're very laissez-faire and hands-off to the extent that third-party organizers and third-party run leagues even have a more prominent role in the competitive play at professional level. So there's not one way for these companies to be involved with the esports titles themselves, but once again, they have an intractable hold and influence over what goes on, just because at any point in time they maintain the last say on matters regarding their game title and their intellectual property. So listed here are some of the top tournaments for major esports titles across the world. And the takeaway, before we dive into the numbers for these listed here, starting with the Intel Extreme Masters, League of Legends World Championship, the Dota 2 International, and Turner Sports E-League, is that the nature of these properties differ a lot from traditional sports tournaments or any sort of competitive league structure. A lot of that has to do with the diversity with regards to how different game publishers, as we went over previously, allow their game IP to be used. So, for example, Riot Games, the publisher of League of Legends, they are very restrictive to the extent that they don't let anyone run League of Legends leagues outside of their own league championship series, LCS. So they are the sole source of professional play across the world, and they are very top-down and hierarchical about how they manage it. Whereas Turner Sports was able to create their own Counter-Strike Global Offensive League, literally, in that they set up entire league operations, broadcast structure, media around a league of Counter-Strike Global Offensive, because the publisher for that game, Valve, is very hands-off. So not only is there a great deal of diversity with regards to how these tournaments are structured, but there's also the potential for chaos in that, for example, while the E-League was running, there were other literally concurrently running Counter-Strike Global Offensive tournaments where some of the teams in E-League were playing literally in another league at the same time that they were playing in Turner's E-League. So right there you can see the massive differences between a traditional sport and esports, but you can also see how at this stage in evolution the industry has quite a bit of potential for chaos. And a lot of that will be worked out, but the reality is right now there's a lot to be left, or there's a lot to be desired in terms of consistency for the events that take place and their structure and so forth. But let's get to some of the numbers behind these events. And one thing to keep in mind about these numbers is that they tend to take place over a number of days. So these aren't single broadcasts, 2 to 3 hour broadcasts. They are aggregate numbers across oftentimes multiple days, sometimes multiple weekends of event attendees, viewers, streamed content, and the like. So the first property, the Intel Extreme Masters in Katowice, Poland in 2017, featured 46 million unique views over 2 distinct weekends. And for IEM, there were multiple game titles being played across these different days. The median ticket price was a little over $60 and $688,000 plus in prize money was awarded to a number of different teams and participants. The viewership was up 35.45%. As a matter of fact, ESL, which is a big organizer involved with IEM, was said that this was the most popular esports event to date in terms of engagement. Now, the League of Legends World Championship, which took place in the fall of 2016, featuring the world's #1 competitive video game title, League of Legends. This featured 43 million unique viewers with over 37,000 in attendance over the course of the tournament. Now, the median ticket price was $55, but one of the key features of the World Championships was Riot Games, the publisher of League of Legends, their ability to move the games across the world. So the games took place across multiple continents: Europe, Asia, and North America, and resulted in over $6 million in prize money being granted to the winner. Now, the Dota 2 International 6, and the International takes place every year in August. It's taken place, last year it took place in Seattle's Key Arena, and it will once again. This tournament features the most prize money ever awarded for an esports tournament to date. And Valve Software, the company behind Defense of the Ancients 2, they implement a very innovative crowdfunding mechanism that allows gamers and spectators to buy what they call the compendium, which is basically a bag of digital goods, and the price of the compendium goes to funding the prize pool. And getting back to what we mentioned earlier about how these different tournaments, or how tournaments differ, that's enabled Valve to continually set the bar for the highest esports prize pool ever given away. And every time this tournament takes place, there's always a lot of buzz about the amount of money and how much money competitive video gamers are winning. But it's important to keep in mind that the International takes place once a year, and it's by no means descriptive of the average esports prize pool. So yes, 20 million was in prize money was granted to teams, but that's nowhere close to the median value for prize pools for most game titles, or even for Dota 2 tournaments outside the International. But who organizes the competition? So There are some game publishers like Riot Games that are very instrumental in making sure that their leagues run a certain way. They fund them, they run them, they manage them. They are the end all, the be all. However, for the game publishers who don't have as an active role, an ecosystem of third-party organizers, tournament organizers, events organizers, league organizers have arisen. And this is an area that a lot of investors are really looking heavily at, because the fact is, esports tournaments, not only do they do well online, but they tend to do pretty well when they actually hold good, well-organized events. So there are a number of parties and stakeholders in the events in the traditional sports world who want to bring these events on site to their stadiums and to their physical property. But the reality is that throwing and running successful esports events is difficult, and it takes a lot of experience. You have to have the right people, and because these events are semi-annual in that it's not like it's a series of games that take place in a stadium week after week, getting that competence and getting that expertise isn't exactly easy. Some of the leading players, though, are ESL, which is the largest non-game publisher esports company in the world, DreamHack, Millennial Esports, and then Evo. Now, DreamHack and ESL are owned by the Modern Times Group, which is a European-based media company, and there are some questions around who owns the companies that own these competitive events, or who organize these competitive events, just because there's a clear potential for conflict of interest if a certain party owns events and they want to exert their commercial interests over control of the market, and there is no governing body that says, hey, these are when these events will take place, these are how they're regulated, these are how they're to be governed. So right now there's still a Wild Wild West element to organizing these events, despite the fact that you've seen how the top ones can generate quite a bit of money, but also excitement and viewership. Now, where do these events air? Where do they broadcast? Esports has long been a digitally native sport, and there have been efforts to get it onto TV. Turner's E-League was a very strong effort, and there is more and more traction with regards to getting gaming content onto linear television. But the reality is that esports is so inherently global that it has to exist online. So spectators and fans are spread across the world, and it's very, very difficult to get that content, to get that reach on linear TV. So outlets like the aforementioned Twitch, but also a new set of players in Twitter, YouTube, and even Facebook have entered the fray to host this content. And by purchasing the rights to broadcast this content, players like Twitter and Facebook are looking to leverage esports audiences as they move towards being a home for digital entertainment. And Twitter and Facebook specifically, because Twitch and YouTube have long been homes for gaming content, Twitter and Facebook, their esports strategy fits in with their general sports strategy of buying rights to traditional sports broadcasts. And so there's a small degree of competitive rivalry as it relates to where competitive video game content will live and will be broadcasted. However, there's nothing in the way of a formal or traditional rights marketplace for leagues and teams to sell their content. So we're at the very early stages of figuring out who's going to, or rather, what role each of these different outlets will play. The reality is, though, that most gaming content will continue to exist on Twitch and on YouTube, but there's a tremendous demand for these broadcasts, so we'll be very quickly seeing more players and even more contentiousness between these listed companies over the near term. Now, let's take a look at some of the issues and outlook for the entire esports landscape. And this is important because in any rapidly evolving space, growth creates chaos, and it also creates gaps. One of the main gaps is in integrity. And as it was mentioned earlier, there is no IOC for esports. There is no governing body to look to help shed light on issues surrounding competitive integrity. There isn't a single source of governance as it relates to issues around things like drug testing for esports players, which, believe it or not, is actually a thing. Match fixing, gambling. And so all of these different issues that arise whenever you have a competitive outlet that attracts viewership that's of any value, there really isn't yet a formal way to manage the solutions or to create the solutions for some of these issues. And so what we're seeing is a scattershot approach by a number of different players, including the Esports Integrity Commission. That's a UK-based organization that's really attempting to gather enough partners such that it can emerge as a home for some of the integrity challenges surrounding esports, but there still isn't a single home for addressing them. Issues around intellectual property and licensing. On the previous screen, we saw how more and more players are looking to broadcast this content. At some point in time, it's going to become an issue that game publishers are going to want to address, in the sense that if a company like Valve, who is very loose with its restrictions around who can air their content, decides to say, hey, we want a cut of whatever you're making from this stuff, it could change very quickly. And then unionization. As more money, prize money, salary money for players enters the picture, there's going to be natural contentions between the people who are making money off of the broadcasts, off of the tournaments at the gate, and how much the players are actually getting. And so right now, there really isn't much movement in this area, but it's important to keep in mind that if the industry continues to grow, players are going to be at a disadvantage for some of the potentially powerful influences that are kind of pushing the industry in an area towards a continued growth. And so that unionization will probably quickly become an issue that will affect the overall outlook for competitive video games across the world. And now to answer the question that everybody has about esports, which is, how much money does it make? Well, according to Newzoo Research, esports industry is targeted to generate $696 million in 2017. Now, that's not a tremendous amount of money, but there's one thing to keep in mind about esports, is that it's fractional. And by fractional, I mean that most of the revenues are indirect. For example, in traditional sports, when a young child sees his favorite Major League Baseball player swing a bat and he or she wants to go out and buy that bat, they can go online or they can go to a sporting goods retailer and purchase the bat. And that revenue is tagged as a part of the sports industry's revenue, right? It's a good that's been purchased. In esports, when a gamer watches a a game of Counter-Strike Global Offensive and decides that he or she needs a mouse or a keyboard, or they decide to go and play a match of Counter-Strike Global Offensive and purchase a digital item in the form of a skin, that revenue, either for the keyboard or the mouse, or even for the purchase of that digital item, is not tagged as an esports revenue. So it's important to keep that in mind as you look at these numbers and you look at the projections. One key piece to understand there is the lion's share of revenue being generated today still is as a result of brand investment through advertising or sponsorship. And so as more and more non-endemic brands become comfortable with competitive video games, the direct revenues will grow. But also keep in mind that the lack of general or well-defined media rights marketplace in esports somewhat hampers the type of numbers that you see for top traditional sports that generate revenues in the billions for broadcast rights. And the audience growth, there's a little bit of debate as to what's an esport viewer, who's an enthusiast, but the reality is that this number is growing very rapidly, and it's really targeted to continue to grow as there's more competitive video game content available, but also as more young people grow up playing games. Who's watching? This is another source of debate. A number of different companies and organizations are attempting to get solid demographics on the esports audience, but the reality is really that the gamers and the viewers are a little bit older than most people tend to think. While esports is incredibly millennial centric, there are quite a few, the average age is, as Nielsen reports here, 31. There are older viewers. And this number is only going to continue to grow, right? Because over time, people that don't die, they age. And the 18-year-olds of today will be the 28-year-olds, and the 24-year-olds will be the 34-year-olds. And so the growth trajectory for esports in terms of its coverage and its appeal is only set to really grow over time. And finally, prize money. One thing to keep in mind about prize money in esports is that 7 to 10 years ago, tournament prize pools were really the only sustainable source of income for players and for teams. Today, that's changing. So while from 2013 to 2016, prize money awarded across all esports games have quadrupled, what's a better health indicator for the industry is that alternate sources of income for players and teams has increased, including regular salaries that don't include winning prize pools for players, and teams being able to make money in other ways, such as the sale of merchandise and partnerships with a growing array of brands and sponsors. But the reality is that the total prize pool amounts is still a leading KPI for growth of the esports industry. And projecting to 2017, it looks like the prize money could breach the $150 million mark, which would actually be nearly a 100-fold increase over 14 years ago, where it was a little over $1.5 million. And so that's all we have for the first session. I want to thank you guys for joining me, and I'll catch you guys the next time around. Thanks.